Welcome to Logistics 206, part 1 of the first week. What we're going to be talking about is supply chain management in this section. So going to our learning objectives, which you'll always see at the beginning of any presentation I provide. This one is going to cover the first two concepts, which is understanding what is supply chain management by definition and how does it apply. And then we're going to look at a couple different ways to analyze how supply chains are described, managed, different tools or models. So like any good instructor would do, I need to first tell you what am I talking about. Let's start with some definitions. What is a supply chain? Here is the Apex Dictionary definition. If you don't know who Apex is a nonprofit organization that is a professional organization for people that are in operations and supply chain management roles, and purchasing falls under that. So they wrote the dictionary that defines a lot of the terms that we use in industry. So using them as a reference here, the definition of supply chain is the design, or supply chain management specifically, the design, planning, execution, control, and monitoring of supply chain activities that with the objective of creating value and profit. So what it is you got different companies participating in different supply chains, and the idea is to have a competitive structure between yourselves and your suppliers and your customers to leverage all the logistics, supply, and demand, making sure that everything flows as it should. Now that all may sound like a bunch of gobbledygook right now, but as we break this down further in the next few slides, you'll see what I mean by this. So this is the baseline definition of supply chain management. Where did this come from? Well, you may see that many universities, for example, have degrees in operations management, and some have degrees in operations and supply chain management, or just supply chain management. Well, it's kind of a chicken-egg argument. Which came first? They've been together the whole time. That's why on this graphic you see operations management is the smaller circle enveloped by the supply chain management circle. They cannot exist without each other. It's a symbiotic relationship. Operations management is the focus on the internal operations or what the organization does, converting raw materials or purchase materials into a good or service that people want to buy. It's just focusing on the inside. Supply chain management tries to work to have suppliers that are providing those raw materials and customers that are buying the finished materials work to integrate into the inside business. So I have a few models that kind of demonstrate this, but both of these concepts and disciplines have been around for a very long time. Only thing is they didn't have names. So operations management came to be as a discipline in the mid 40s and 50s, and the term supply chain management didn't really become a term until the 90s, when companies started to realize, hey, it's not about just what we do, but how do our customers work? How do our suppliers work? And if we all can get along, all those processes work together, maybe we can make more money and value. And that's why there's been an evolution towards this concept of operations and supply chain management. Now, why do we care? Oh, well, like I mentioned, if you want to make big money in an organization, you've got to be able to understand what your customer wants. Supply chain thinking requires that you think about and contact your suppliers and figure out, what do they actually want, instead of assuming that your organization has all the answers. Now, you may have good ideas. Don't get me wrong. But if your customer is the one that's buying the product, you might want to figure out what they need, what they want to buy first before making anything. So it takes bringing in the processes that your customers do and integrating them into your business. We've encountered over the last several years a technology boom in which you now have an app for nearly everything. What that is a small example of supply chain integration in your life, making it easier for you, the customer, to be able to integrate your processes, decision making, and buying habits with the supplier, which could be anyone from a store to a game, whatever the case may be. So it takes information technology linkages like an app, but also other hard-coded ways of integrating processes across the board. So take it from the customer into your organization, in the same way working to integrate your practices and processes with your supplier. So you have seamless transactions from customer through to supplier. So I'm describing some terms here. Customer, you, manufacturer, supplier. Let's look at it this way. We have a model called the supply chain model, which is very basic. And I use this model in describing supply chain functions, regardless of the business, whether it be manufacturing, service, doesn't matter. All businesses, all supply chains have these characteristics. We talk about the basic supply chain model. We're talking about three entities, three major groupings of entities. You have one entity, which is the supplier, one entity, which is your manufacturer, and one entity, which is your customer. Now, we're going to position ourselves in the middle here. Say like you are the manufacturer or service provider. You could be a restaurant. You can be manufacturing widgets. It doesn't matter. You may have a first-line customer or tier customer that you sell to directly. Then they sell on to someone else. That creates a second tier. They sell on to someone else and someone else and someone else, and ultimately ending up in the end user or end consumer's hand. Then there's several layers to that, or tiers, but all of those tiers of customer base are considered part of a customer entity. In the same way with suppliers, you might buy product from one supplier. They buy product from another supplier, all the way down until where the product or item is harvested from the ground, the sky, the water, or space. Who knows? So you have suppliers, manufacturers, and customers. Now, I always challenge people, go and look around, figure out where you are in the mix. Are you the supplier, the customer, the manufacturer? Those are the entities. Four other characteristics are the primary flows of that companies work to communicate, which is the first one is information. You notice the information flow. The arrows are pointing both directions. So information is flowing back from the customer to the manufacturer to the supplier. The same way, information such as supply constraints or pricing would go from supplier to manufacturer to customer. The primary flow of products and services should be from the supplier to the manufacturer to the customer. Why that's the primary flow is because the supplier sells to the manufacturer converts the material, and it's sold to the customer. In the same way, when it's sold to the customer, payment is issued from the customer back to the manufacturer to back to the supplier. So the primary flow of cash is back from customer to supplier. Now the reverse flow of products happens when we recycle or remanufacture or return product from customer back to the supplier. It has its own process of maintaining. In business, when things go wrong, typically it's because one of these four flows is not working. Something has been broken. Either information hasn't been shared, the primary flow of products is not moving, cash is not being sent back, things like that. So whenever there's a supply chain issue that I encounter at work, I always try and figure out, who am I in this process? Am I the supplier, manufacturer, or the customer? And where did the breakdown happen on the four flows? Now, taking this a little further, something you may be familiar with, I'm looking at a fast food restaurant here. The fast food restaurant is the manufacturer. The converting of raw materials purchased from the regional distribution center, in this case, into product that is sold to the end user, which is the customer. Now, there can be layers in the customer end, now that we have services like Grubhub and other Uber Eats and things like that, where companies have inserted themselves in the middle of the customer tier, where you buy from them, they buy from the fast food restaurant, and they deliver it to you. So, the supply end on this slide here, what I'm showing is a regional distribution center, which then buys from farmers and packing suppliers and so on. The information flow is still there, product flow is still there, cash and reverse flow. Reverse flow in this context could be anything from returnable containers back through the regional distribution center, such as bread baskets, or it could be, hey, return to sender, the food wasn't right. So things like that. Now, this is a very simple model and it's easily applicable to services and manufacturing. A more complicated model, though equally important, is the APICS SCORE model. Now, SCORE is an acronym that stands for Supply Chain Operational Reference. And what APICS has done is says all organizations, regardless of what you do, have 5 main activities. Every organization should have a planning aspect, like a business plan, a strategy. They source something, they manufacture or convert something, even if it's a service, and deliver, and then there's the return aspect. So, you see here in the center of the slide, you have an organization, says your company, and they do plan, source, make, deliver, and return. Your customer also has the same activities, plan, source, make, deliver, and return, and your supplier. So you've got the 3 entities listed here, and we all do the same thing. Now, in supply chain management, we're looking at integrating our processes. So when your company manufactures something, we're delivering it to the customer. You see how the deliver and the source bubbles kind of touch? That's because they're connected. They're linked together in the supply chain, a visual chain. In the same way, when your company sources something from your supplier, they deliver it. So to integrate these processes is the big challenge. And so the SCORE model or reference, what it does is it analyzes what does best practices look like in organizations that are fully integrated. And what they've developed is a benchmarking tool, to SCORE reference, to be able to say where is your organization at in its ability to link up with customers and suppliers in integrating processes that help reduce the amount of time in waiting, cost, and create value. So here's an example of some what I call the symptoms chart of the different stages of levels of integration. Now what SCORE does is it breaks down stage 1 through 4 in each of the areas of the supply chain. So you have make, plan, source, make, deliver, and return. There will be different benchmarks of activity of level 1 through 4 for each of those categories. Now, I'm not asking you to memorize this by any stretch. This is just an awareness that there is a lot of research out there on how to integrate supply chains. Now, some of you may be reading ahead, and that's perfectly fine. On this screen, looking at what does stage 1 mean? If you've had any working experience at all, you'll say, yeah, my company used to be a type 1 or type 2. All companies tend to start out as a stage 1. Very impulsive, reactionary activities. No one's really working together, little information exchange. That's kind of what happens when you bring people together to do something. Even teamwork ends up like this sometimes. And then you start to, okay, we're going to get anything done. If we're going to be, we need to work together at minimum. Okay, let's start working out processes and practices. Let's look at best price purchasing, low price purchasing strategies. Let's start looking at working together. Now, still departments may have their own goals that aren't too coordinated, but we're starting to get functional. It isn't until stage 3 we go, okay, let's look at the full processes from start to finish. From how does our customer order from us? How do we know what to buy from our supplier? Oh, let's use some technology like MRP and ERP systems, which we'll talk about later on in the course. And we'll look at enhancing warehousing and look at continuous improvement. Stage 4 is really reserved for organizations that have spent a lot of time breaking down boundaries between themselves and their customers and their supply base, sharing information from operating system of your company directly into the operating system of your suppliers and customers, looking at competing on a full supply chain level, looking at your customers and suppliers as your biggest partners in achieving market success. Very few companies actually reach this level. So this is just a quick overview of SCORE. I could talk about it for days. And there's a lot of research out there. So if that's something you're interested in, go do some internet searching and let's have some conversations. But let's just make sure we covered part 1 effectively. We talked about what supply chain management is by definition. And we talked about the different models, the basic model, the 3 entities and 4 flows, and the SCORE model. If you have any questions or would like to discuss further, please feel free to reach out to me. In the meantime, I hope you have a great day.